Hello, ladies. So we're moving on to look at CC8. This is PowerPoint 3, and we're looking at externalities, merit goods, and demerit goods. So we're going to start by considering what externalities are, and then also look at how the social benefit and private benefit and social cost and social and private cost has to be considered when we're looking at externalities. So let's take a look at this as we go. So basically, externalities, what are they? So they're common in virtually every area of economic activity, and you really want to be looking at page 13 in your booklets, your CC8 booklets. And essentially what they're defined as is third-party or overspill effects arising from the production and or consumption of goods and services. For which there are no appropriate compensation being paid. So effectively, when you do something within an economy or within, an item is produced, it's considering all of the costs of that particular, and in some cases the benefits of that particular thing being produced. So let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail then. So we've got a couple of examples, one showing there the positive production externalities caused by a power station. And you can see, you might think, are there any positives? Well, actually, in this instance, if we've got hot water discharge into the lake that the coal-burning power station is based at, that's going to mean that the warmer water will actually encourage an increase in the size of fish, etc., and also higher yields from the lake. So that clearly could be considered to be a positive production externality. However, when we think about what the negative production externalities of a power station could be, where we've got acid rain pollution, we've got commercial forestry being damaged by that, could be a residential area, so we could have all sorts of issues with climate change, etc. And also we've got eyesore pollution with the pylons and the electricity crackling through the various different wires that are being strung from the pylons. So in essence, what we're talking about is that externalities can cause market failure. Okay, and what that means is that the market is possibly not achieving the socially optimum allocation of resources, and that considers the social benefit and also the social cost of this particular item being produced or a good or service being provided. So when we look at social benefit, we have to consider two things. We have to consider the private benefit that each individual will get from consuming that particular good or service, but also some of the external benefits. Okay. Now, in some instances, when we consume a particular good, say education, for instance, then the total benefit to society is greater than just what I receive from that particular thing, in that we get a higher level of production capacity within the economy, we get better workforce, etc., etc. Okay, so it's something to bear in mind. So when we see social benefit, you need to consider the private benefit, but also the external benefits that that particular good or service might bring. Okay, so that's something just to bear in mind. I'm going to have to keep moving my face around. I think I'll move up there, to be honest, so that it's a bit easier and less distracting on the screen. If we then take a look at social cost, so we talked about social benefit, now we've got to think about the social cost, okay? And that essentially is the private cost, so what it costs you to buy the good or service, but also some of the external costs that might be incurred by that particular good or service being produced. Okay, so again, thinking about this social cost, it's basically the total cost to society of using resources in a particular way. Okay, not just what it costs to produce, but what is the total cost to society. And these are two of the fundamental principles, okay, where we're talking about both positive and negative production externalities, but also the social benefit and the social cost, rather than just the private cost, which in some instances that's all we've been really considering as far as this is concerned so far. Now, what we need to do, we keep coming back to this principle of marginal analysis once again, And essentially what we're doing here is saying effectively we're looking at decisions that have been made at the margin. Okay, so producing one extra unit may bring in more marginal revenue, but it may also have a marginal cost, which is nothing new. We've been talking about that for quite some time, haven't we? Okay. In this instance, if we're talking about the marginal social cost, okay, that's including the private costs and the external costs of producing one extra unit of output, okay, and that obviously is then borne by the consumer and or a third party if that third party is affected by the consumption or the production of that particular good. When we talk about marginal social benefit, that includes the private and external benefits of consuming one more unit, received by the consumer and or a third party. Okay, so this marginal social cost and marginal social benefit is quite an important principle, and we'll show how that works diagrammatically shortly. The ideal is to try to achieve the socially optimum allocation of resources, where essentially the marginal social benefit equals the marginal social cost. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do. That means essentially we're producing the good or the service in the best way we can, and we're getting the maximum marginal social benefit. And that marginal social benefit isn't any greater than the marginal social cost. Okay. Now, in some instances where we're talking about demand curve, then that's generally the marginal private benefit curve. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we think about what we as individuals are getting in terms of the benefit. And then we're actually measuring the additional utility or satisfaction gained by the consumer from that last unit being consumed. Okay, and we'll show how that works diagrammatically shortly. The other thing that will be very helpful for you to do is to take a look at pages 14 and 15, where there is quite a nice explanation of what I've just described there. And it's worth taking a look at that and making sure that you understand those principles, okay? And we'll take a look at that in a little bit more detail as we go through the next few slides. The last point to make is that in this instance, the supply curve is generally the marginal private cost curve, okay, MPC. These letters that you'll see, they will start to make a bit more sense when we start to draw in diagrams of how this whole thing works, okay? So the supply curve generally is considered to be the marginal private cost curve, measuring the cost to the firm of the last unit produced, okay? And that will obviously be the thing that they will be considering quite clearly when it comes to whether they produce the extra unit or not. Okay, so let's take a look at how this model works then when we're looking at negative production externalities. Okay, so we can see here we've got a marginal private benefit equaling our marginal social benefit. So at this point, you can see if we take our original equilibrium here at the point here, Q1, we would produce at Q1 and charge at P1. But because in this case we've got coal-fired burning, so and our marginal private cost, sorry, I'm just going back one, our marginal private cost is at this point here. We can see that the marginal social cost, in this case, what's been caused by the negative production externality of the coal burning power station, is significantly higher than that. And you can see as a result of that there is a loss, a welfare loss or deadweight loss of at the free market price of Q1. Okay, so you can see that effectively that's where we should be producing at, but fundamentally the market is not doing so, and so effectively we've got a loss of welfare in that area. Okay. Now, again, I seem to be in the way again. I'll move myself over here again. I might have to move again shortly, okay? If we then take a look then at the way in which this whole thing works, okay, so that's pretty much what we've just described. We should actually be able to then show what this means. Okay, so if we take, again, I'm sorry to keep moving myself around, but in this case, in the situation we have here, the marginal private cost of production is less than the marginal social cost, okay, as we've just described, and that leads to the good or service being overproduced relative to the social optimum, okay, as we can see there. If the government chose not to intervene in this scenario, okay, the good or service is either going to be underpriced, and then the negative externalities are not going to be taken into account, okay? Because the marginal private cost for supply is at this low level, then the producer basically doesn't really give two hoots about the fact that there's a higher marginal social cost. There's no incentive for them to produce less. And so, unless the government intervenes, you are going to find this scenario where it could be underpriced and because the negative externalities have not been taken into account. So, we get negative externalities when the marginal private cost is lower than the marginal social cost. Okay, if you remember that as a principle, that should help you. In this case, we get this dead weight loss in this triangle here, as you can see. Okay, so what we're saying here is that we've got lost some economic welfare. Okay, now in this scenario, because of that, in terms of welfare, the markets will overproduce goods that generate external costs. Okay, they will carry on producing because it's obviously in their interest. And so in this scenario, in order to try and address this, the government might need to intervene to reduce the welfare loss to the point where, again, that point that we mentioned earlier, where the marginal social cost actually equals the marginal social benefit. Okay, at the moment, this scenario doesn't do that, does it? Okay, but what we're trying to do is try to get to the point where our marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit. Okay, so let's move on and take a look at the next thing. Okay, so thinking about some negative externalities then. Okay, we've got a case study that we'll look at in a minute, or you can take a look at in a minute, on the Fawley Oil Refinery, and also some questions for you to answer. But effectively, what we're saying here is that remember, our social cost is the private cost of producing something plus any external cost. And in this situation, okay, if we've got external costs where effectively the social costs of production are greater than the private costs, that means that, say, for instance, with a coal-fired power station, you've got a number of private costs, so the raw material for the actual power station, like the coal, wages, running costs, etc. But there are significant third-party costs that are imposed upon society, like the visual impact of the ugly building, the poor air quality affecting the health of individuals in nearby residential neighbourhoods, the impact of acid rain on forests and lakes, and the climate control issues. So significant issues as far as negative externalities of that particular industry. And clearly, one of the things that we have to consider is that coal companies and consumers pay for certain things. They pay for fuel, they pay for that in order for operations and maintenance to be produced, and they have capital costs. But however, everybody pays for the negative externalities, the health impacts, the environmental degradation, and also any subsidies that might be being paid to the providers of that particular good or service. So there's the case study of the Fawley Oil Refinery, which, for any of you that know the area reasonably well over towards Hampshire, there is a massive ExxonMobil oil refinery based in Fawley. Now, clearly, in this instance, and you'll see that there is some case study material for you to take a look at, and also some details on their production capacity, what they output, and also and the number of workers on site. So clearly, one could argue that they provide some positive production externalities in terms of providing work for the local area, and clearly they are producing significant amounts of oil that can be used for further products, etc. However, there are, in this case, some issues around that, okay? And on the slide here, it tells you a little bit about the case where there is significant pollution issues and also some questions for you to answer, okay? So looking at identifying the major group of people who you might consider to be a third party, and why would they be a third party? Have they been affected by this in this instance, and also think about some of the costs that producers of running that refinery have, and also some of the external costs to third parties. So again, a good case study, a good local case study that you could find out significant amounts of information about, should you choose to, and you can then use that as an example for externalities and showing examples of how that might work. Okay, so I'll leave you to have a go at those questions independently, but moving on to the next thing, page 17. Okay, there's a principle. This is in your CCA booklet. A principle known as the tragedy of the commons. Okay, so effectively, what we're saying here. And again, it's quite well explained on page 17 in your booklet. There is an issue around private ownership of property rights. Okay, now in some instances, one could argue that if there is no government ownership or no government control over the property rights and how they might be transferred, in this instance, we're not necessarily going to get the best use of resources if there's no form of government control. And there is was first put forward by a gentleman called Garrett Hardin, and talked about this principle of where you don't have any sort of control over the way in which, in this case, land is used, one of the factors of production. There is a danger that that you may not necessarily get full use of that material, or that, in this case, land, based on the fact that if private industry or private individuals they might choose to leave the land to go fallow, and then there is very little that the government can do about in that scenario. Okay, so in this situation, this tragedy of the commons. So in this case, it's not the commons as in the House of Commons, but making land a common land as opposed to having some sort of control over it and some sort of management of that particular resource, that can cause significant issues. Okay, so again, I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but if you take a look at the example cited to illustrate that, it gives you an idea of how things can happen. Okay, so in some cases, if there's no incentive for the land user to keep the land in good condition, then there is a danger that could actually mean that the resource is under utilized in lots of ways. Okay, moving on then. If we're moving on to page 18 and 19, a couple of example questions using the principles of what we just talked about. This principle of marginal private and social benefit. Okay, so remembering that MPB is the marginal private benefit and the MSB is the marginal social benefit. Okay, so again, depending on which one is higher than the other, we should be able to then assess whether there would be a misallocation of resources and what has caused it. Okay, so in this instance, we've got an absence of government intervention, and there would be a misallocation of resources. Why? Well, in this instance, if you take a look at that, have a go at answering that question and see if you can explain exactly why that should be the case. Okay, typical short questions that you might get as an example. Okay, so in this instance, explain two likely negative externalities caused by the decision to allow the building of a third runway at Heathrow Airport. Well, I would think you can immediately think of one, but maybe have a think about the second reason for that too. Okay, and that would be a typical 4-mark question. Okay, if we take a look at the next question on page 19, again, this is something where you might need to spend a bit of time just having to think about it. But we've got a market, or the diagram showing here, the market for the extraction of stone from a quarry. Okay, we've got to assume there are no external benefits, and which of the following is true on this basis. Okay, so there are 4 options for you to choose from. Again, taking a look at the previous slides that we talked about, and also your booklet, and possibly the textbook as well. Take a look at that and see if you can come up with which one of those statements is true. The social optimum quantity exceeds the free market equilibrium quantity. So in this case, the social cost, the marginal social cost, is higher than the marginal private cost. So we're going to have some deadweight loss. We're going to have some welfare loss there, aren't we? Okay, so in this instance, we should be able to then assess whether the social optimum quantity exceeds the free market equilibrium quantity. Okay, well, it clearly would be the case, wouldn't it? Because the social optimum is the marginal social cost, so that quantity being produced should be at a higher level than the free market, which was originally at QE. Okay, so take a look at that and assess each one of them, and then come up with the answer that you think it should be. Okay, some follow-up questions. Explain two likely negative externalities caused by the quarry. State how this negative affects third parties. And then there is a data response question on page 20 in your booklets, okay, where you are looking at EU and mackerel fish quotas, okay, and then there is a question, a 15-mark question, which is to examine the likely external costs of overfishing of mackerel. Use an appropriate diagram in your answer. Okay, so again, assess whether you think that overfishing is a good thing or a bad thing. Is there any sort of cost involved, marginal, social, and private benefit too? So have a look at that and give that some consideration. Okay, let's take a look at positive externalities now then. Okay, so we looked at negative externalities. Then in this instance, we've also got some positive externalities that we might need to consider. So again, remember our social benefit is the private benefit plus the external benefits that we might get from a particular good or service. Okay, so when we have external benefits, that exist, okay, that means that we have extra benefits to society of an economic transaction, okay, so they're greater than the individual consumer of the good receives, and so there are additional benefits to third parties. The previous ones, the negative externalities you just looked at, don't have any additional benefits. They have additional costs effectively, don't they? But in this instance, we're looking at where there might be some positive externalities, and we'll take a look at some examples of that in a minute. Okay, so for instance, a really good example would be vaccination, particularly current with the pandemic. So effectively, if we have individuals vaccinated, that actually includes a number of other benefits. Okay, so obviously there's a reduced risk of illness, but also a healthier life, maybe a greater ability to work and to earn and have a longer life. So with that, there are all sorts of other benefits, third-party benefits to a decent and successful vaccination program. Other benefits could be that the third parties involved may be less likely to catch the disease, and society will benefit from generally lower healthcare costs because of that. And you couldn't give a better example of the pandemic and the process of the vaccination process that's been so successful in the UK. Okay, so if we then take a look at the model showing positive consumption externalities, and again, this is based on marginal analysis, we've got a diagram which is shown there and is also provided to you in the next few pages, as you'll see when you start to look through. So in this case, we're saying that our positive externalities are caused by a social benefit being greater than the private benefit. Okay, so the social optimum, in this case Q2, is higher than the private optimum. Okay, and in this scenario, if the market chooses to ignore these positive externalities, then there may be underconsumption of that particular good or service. Okay, so again, there might have to be some intervention by the government to try to encourage that process. And again, we're using marginal analysis to demonstrate this. Okay, so in this case, we've got the marginal private benefit being less than the marginal social benefit of consumption, as we can see. So we've got the marginal private benefit in this area here. We've got the marginal social benefit at a much higher level here. Okay. So in this instance, our marginal social benefit is higher than our marginal private benefit. Okay. Now that essentially could lead to goods or services being underproduced relative to the social optimum. Okay. So remember, the social optimum is where we are actually basically have the same marginal social cost and marginal social benefit being the same. Okay, so without any government intervention, we're going to have an issue where positive externalities will not be taken into account, and clearly that then means that we're going to have another deadweight loss of economic welfare or welfare gain if more is consumed on the basis of the analysis and diagram that we've shown here. Okay. In this instance, then, the government might need to intervene, as we mentioned before, and as a result of that, what we're trying to do is make sure that the marginal social cost equals the marginal social benefit, as I've just mentioned previously. Okay, let's take a look at education then. Clearly, we all are involved in education, so we clearly know something about education, but when we think about the benefits, the costs and the benefits, to both individuals and to society, you can see that education as a principle, there are some costs clearly. We've got transport to get to school, we've got books, we've got uniform, we've got school fees, maybe school fees, could also be foregoing production based on loss of earnings of other production on the basis of choosing to go to school or further your education rather than going into business and industry and producing goods and services. Okay. Now, some of the benefits you could say for individuals is that they tend to get increased productivity on the basis of getting better skilled. But also there are some other private benefits, maybe better personal health, expanded capacity to enjoy leisure, increased efficiency in job search and other personal choices. So all of those things with education, you tend to find that those things tend to be significant benefits. Okay. If we then take a look at society and third parties as well, if you like, there is clearly a cost. The public sector and spends an awful lot of money on providing educational establishments, buildings, teachers, etc. And that is a significant cost, and there is an opportunity cost to that because it means that the government has to spend money providing education and not being able to spend it on other things as a result. Okay. However, one could argue some of the benefits of having a decent education system is that we get some significant improvements in worker productivity. So when a person has better education or is better skilled, that's going to probably mean that production will be enhanced. Possibility of expanded technological possibilities with the adaptation of new knowledge or science or innovation of some description, that clearly can be significant benefit to the whole of society, and significant community benefits too, as you can see. So clearly, one of the things that you need to be able to do is to explain how those three external benefits of education can be a positive, and in this instance, clearly that would be a relatively straightforward thing to do. If we then take a look then at externalities and sort of sum them up, okay, we've said that externalities can basically cause market failure. Okay, that's where the free market, is basically not achieving a social optimum allocation of resources. Okay. And that's particularly if the price mechanism doesn't take into account both the full social costs and the full social benefits of production and consumption. Okay, so when that free market is not doing that, then there is a danger that we're not going to provide the optimum use of resources, and that's going to cause forms of market failure, probably partial rather than complete market failure. So, what's that meaning? If we try to put it in simple terms, it means that the full cost or the benefit is not reflected in the market price that is being charged. And in those scenarios, clearly the free market will not lead to an optimum allocation of resources. So these externalities will create an issue where there is a form of market failure. Clearly, in this instance, it could be costs or benefits that are incurred or enjoyed. So obviously costs are incurred, benefits would be enjoyed by the third party who hasn't actually been directly involved in that transaction. Okay, and as a result of that, that means that the decisions, the implication is that these decisions are not being made with the best interests of society at heart. Okay, and again, that could be down to a producer having more information and asymmetric information being at play, and we'll see a little bit later that can be a bit of an issue that needs to be considered too. Okay, let's take a look at the positive externalities of consumption then. Okay, so we've looked at some of the positive externalities of production. Let's have a look at consumption. Okay, so this again is where we're talking about the social benefit being greater than the private benefits, and that can harm third parties without some form of compensation. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the things that we could be considering. Okay, so clearly we've got education, we've got healthcare, we've got increasing involvement in the arts, and why would that necessarily provide some form of positive externality on consumption? Okay, so some quite nice examples, and also a couple of short films for you to take a look at too, but I'll let you have a look at those at your leisure, and that will obviously help you to understand that in a bit more detail. So let's take a look at positive externalities in a bit more detail then. Basically, they happen when consumption creates external benefits on third parties outside of the market. Okay, so in this instance, you might get what are known as third-party spillover benefits, and that results in the social benefit of consumption being greater than the private benefit. Okay, so what sort of things could that be? Might be in the form of a range of things. Could be lower costs for other parties. Could be increased revenues and profits for other parties too. But more specifically, it's likely to provide increased utility or satisfaction for other parties, okay? Not just the person who's making the purchase or choosing to use that resource in some shape or form, but also providing utility and satisfaction for others too. Examples of activities that can create and generate positive externalities include healthcare, as we mentioned, library services or education. This is flood control. We've got art. Now, effectively, if we think about this and maybe explain it in a bit more detail, if we think about education as an example, a well-educated labour force is going to increase efficiency, and that's going to bring important social benefits. It's going to obviously appreciate, or certainly policymakers and governments are appreciating that we get an increase in returns that can be exploited if we actually improve the human capital that we have at our disposal as an economy. Health provision. Clearly, if we get better health provision and better healthcare, that's going to reduce absenteeism. Also going to give better quality of life and higher living standards to those people who are benefiting from that improved health provision. Spending on vaccinations and dentistry to prevent the spread of it, so preventative rather than curative solutions can obviously save the cost of the more serious treatment further down the line. So preventative rather than curative health provision. Flood protection systems, clearly spending on improved fire protection in schools and public arenas, and also flood protection systems are about making sure that people stay safe. okay, and also that the clean up of those scenarios, if they should happen, are significantly less if we've got protection systems in place. And then obviously art spending and sports participation, the enjoyment derived from getting involved in those things, not just in one particular area, but clearly giving a wider appreciation of lots of things within society likely to be of benefit to a whole range of people, which would give positive externalities. So we've talked about that in quite a lot of detail. In terms of private and social benefits, let's take a look at that in a little bit more detail now then, okay? So here's an example of private and social benefits, okay? So here we've got a rather lovely Christmas scene, okay, where the Christmas lights provided by residents actually give some positive production externalities, okay? So the local residents are going to enjoy the decorations, and this adds to their enjoyment of Christmas, okay? So the provider of the lights is essentially sharing the benefits with others, okay? So much as he or she might get the benefit of their house looking pretty and people commenting positively, it also gives some positive externalities to some of the local residents, okay? So in that situation, we've got social benefits to society that are greater than the private benefits received by the provider of the lights. Okay, they've done it on the basis of producing those lights. Have done it on the private benefit that they're going to receive. They haven't really considered the external benefits that it provides to society. But in that scenario, we would have positive consumption externalities. So in this case, we've got a social benefit of consuming a good includes both private and external benefits. And when we look at those decisions, often focusing on the marginal social benefit, which is the benefit to society of consuming an extra unit of a particular good. Okay, so that's what we tend to do when we're trying to assess whether we've got private and social benefits outweighing or social benefits, marginal social benefits outweighing the private cost. So, if we're talking about social benefits, then it's the total benefit of society of using resources in a particular way. And again, remember we looked at that formula right at the start of the presentation. Social benefit is always your private benefit plus any external benefits that that might occur from the production and consumption of those resources. Okay. We take university education as an example. Again, we can break that down into two different areas. We've got both private benefits and external benefits. So private benefits, obviously, if you choose to take a university degree, generally speaking, you're going to be earning higher average earnings over your working life than somebody who hasn't got a degree. You've got qualifications that could lead to another career. You've got higher occupational mobility, enjoyment of being a student, independence, and the chance to live away from home and to continue your studies into greater depth. So that's all private benefits, all reasons why you might choose to go to university. But if we think about the external benefits too, effectively, the more graduates that we have, the greater we have potentially for our production possibility frontier curve. Okay, so an outward shift in supply because labour and the quality of labour has actually significantly improved. What could that lead to? It could increase productivity. That could mean lower cost goods, which could increase your exports, leading to an increase in GDP. So you can see how the external benefits of higher levels of education can make significant contributions to the overall economy. Overseas students obviously can contribute to exports, leading to an increase in aggregate demand, and trained professionals and teachers contributing to health and education of the population, again leading to an upward shift in the aggregate supply curve. We can provide more and better products and services, etc., based on the fact that we have a higher level of skill and within the economy, within the working economy, within our human capital, and improvement in human capital, I suppose, would be a better way of putting it. So if we got positive production externalities, okay, that might mean in some instances that we get a good is going to either be underproduced, underconsumed, and underpriced. So there is a possibility of that happening. Okay, we then take a look at the marginal analysis and how we can demonstrate the positive externalities in consumption and how that might create market failure. You'll see similar sort of diagram to the one that we just talked about previously, where we're looking at positive externalities where the social benefit is actually greater than the private benefit. The social optimum output is Q2, and that's higher than the private optimum. And as a result of that, if the market ignores those positive externalities, there will be underconsumption of that particular good or service because the supplier is only willing to produce at that certain level. Okay, so if we take a look at how that might play out, okay, so again, this marginal analysis comes back in. We're talking about making decisions at the margin, producing the one extra unit, which might bring in more revenue, marginal revenue, but will also have a marginal cost. And it's the difference between those two things that we need to bear in mind, okay? So in this case, our marginal social cost includes the private cost and also the external cost of producing that extra unit of output, okay? So that might be borne by the consumer and or the third party. The marginal social benefit includes the private and the external benefits of consuming that one more unit, and that's received by the consumer and or the third party, okay? So again, in terms of what we're trying to aim to do, we're trying to aim for an optimum social allocation of resources, and that would be where our marginal social benefit equals our marginal social cost. And we'll see in a minute that the government can try to do that using a number of different tools. Okay, so the economics of vaccination is the next thing we're going to take a look at, and you'll see that in this scenario, it's rather small, unfortunately. I didn't realise it was going to produce at that quite such a small level. But there is some information there that I'd like you to take a look at. Okay, it's a couple of paragraphs to have a read of, and then I want you to try and explain two of the external benefits of vaccinations. We've talked about some of them already, but clearly in this instance, we also want to consider what those external benefits might be. Okay. Again, once you've done that, what I'd like you then to consider is the example there, showing you a diagram on vaccinations. And effectively, we're moving on to page 26 now, where we've got that case study that I just showed you, but also the second question where we've got again, a diagram showing the free market for vaccinations in which the current equilibrium price is the current equilibrium output is X and the price is PE. Okay, so we can see that's where we would produce if it was a completely free market. Okay, however, at that level, what have we got going on? Well, we've clearly got a significant level of market failure, haven't we? Because we're not producing at the the marginal social benefit, and where the marginal social cost and the marginal social benefit are equal. So essentially, we've got market failure going on there. Okay, another example of a case study for you to consider based on the positive externalities on public libraries. Okay, just again giving you some information that you could maybe use should you need to give an example of positive externalities, and how in this case the decline of public libraries has caused a number of issues around that, and reasons for that. Okay, so clearly, one of the things that the government is keen to do is to try to arrest that decline and provide alternative services to make sure that these external benefits from public libraries are actually really accounted for. A number of different externality or positive externality policies that government might be able to use. Okay, three areas really where we've got positive externalities. and to increase the consumption of goods where there are actually positive externalities, as we've just described and just shown in diagrammatic form. One, the government might choose to use subsidies, and that's something that we'll look at in a bit more detail later. They might also regulate markets or provide regulations to markets to say you really need to make sure that you produce at this particular level. Okay, subsidies clearly are incentives, essentially provided to producers to allow them to produce more, to increase the consumption of that good where we have positive externalities. And then the third area is where the government can provide further information and provide symmetric information as opposed to asymmetric information, so that everybody is able to make a good and rational decision based on the facts that they have in front of them. Okay, so basic subsidies then. Okay, so let's just take a look at this for a producer. So a subsidy, as it describes here, is per unit causes an outward shift of the market supply curve, leading to a lower equilibrium price. So we can see our original market supply curve was at this level here. Okay, but the subsidy essentially is effectively the number or a value, in this case a subsidy, is the amount that the producer would be able to produce at a lower cost, essentially. And so at that level of subsidy, then the producer would be able to sell at P2, but also provide higher quantities rather than the Q1 that was originally envisaged. Okay, so that's a subsidy diagram, basic subsidy diagram for producers, which essentially allows them to produce more at a lower cost. If we then look at how you might subsidise a merit good to overcome market failure, okay, there again, in this instance, what we're trying to do is to say that we have got the external benefit of this particular good or service is significantly higher, and so what we're doing here is encouraging the marginal private cost has been significantly reduced to by the subsidy to a much lower level, and effectively what we're finding here is that we've got P2, so got a lower price, and in this case that is hopefully going to create greater amounts of production that all can benefit from on that basis. Okay, so in this case the subsidy reduces the marginal private cost of consumption and should lead to an expansion of demand towards the social optimum, but it does obviously depend on the price elasticity of demand for that particular good or service, but that you can see how that might work for a merit good too on that basis. Merit goods, what are they? Well, let's take a look at what they are. Okay, a merit good is essentially a good or service such as education, which has social benefits of consumption that exceed the private benefits. Okay, so again, in this instance, the marginal social benefit is higher than the marginal private benefit. Okay, and so in this scenario, we've got a case where the market will probably underprovide these goods and services because it's not in their interest to produce more, and that could lead to partial market failure as a result. Two characteristics for a merit good. Okay, generally speaking, there are positive externalities, but also there is sometimes a danger that there are information failures, which essentially causes the consumer to distort their choice on what is considered to be the private optimum or optimal level of consumption. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind. Let's take a look at what might happen given the diagram that's been drawn up here. Okay, so if we said that in this situation the government decided to react and to provide a subsidy which reduces the price of education to P2, we can see that essentially means that consumption of education will rise from Q1 to Q2, and it become a more socially optimal level, and the market failure would essentially be corrected in that scenario. Okay. Now, The subsidy in this case is normally a payment of some description that's made by the government, usually to producers, for each unit of subsidised good that they produce. Okay, so effectively it means that they're getting their costs of production for each item are significantly reduced. In some cases, you might find that consumers are subsidised too. So bus passes might be given to children to let them travel on buses for a free or reduced price. Okay, so they can be aimed at consumers as well as producers to try to encourage them to, in this case, obviously use public transport. When we look at demerit goods then, okay, so we talked about merit goods, let's take a look at demerit goods, okay? So generally speaking, a demerit good is, as you can imagine, the opposite to a merit good, okay? So in this scenario, we have this going on. So an example could be tobacco, okay? So that's a good example of a demerit good, okay? Where the social costs of consumption exceed the private costs. Okay, now why should that be? Okay, well, thinking about this as a scenario, if the market was clearly willing to supply at a higher level, okay, that might lead to an overproduction or an overconsumption of goods, so those goods, and that could also lead to possible market failure. Okay, so the social cost here, the private social cost, sorry, let's just move myself again. So we're trying to get to the point where marginal social cost and marginal private cost are the same. But in this situation, we've clearly got the marginal private benefit and the marginal social benefit of smoking and tobacco clearly can be a bit of an issue in a free market. Okay, so that might mean that we're going to overconsume if the market is left to its own devices. And in this scenario, the demerit good has, sorry, I'm just going to move myself again, get myself out of the way a bit, has two characteristics, okay, demerit goods, negative externalities and information failure, which again can distort the consumer's choice on what should be the optimal level of consumption, okay. So that's probably not helped by the producers producing at a higher level, and in turn, so where the marginal social cost and marginal private cost are equal, the marginal private benefit is significantly higher than the marginal social benefit when we consider all of the issues, and clearly that is creating an issue in terms of the overconsumption of tobacco. So, just to sort of sum up then, in terms of externalities and what the government can choose to do, and this is something that we'll look at in a bit more detail in the next presentation, the government's got a range of options that it can choose to use, okay? And that is basically its government intervention, okay? And the areas we're going to look at, and we've touched on a few already, we've certainly touched on subsidies. We're also going to look at indirect taxation. We'll also consider trade pollution permits, which are quite an interesting concept, that in terms of trying to trade public pollution permits, and also we'll look at market regulation too, and regulations to try to encourage producers to, and in some cases consumers, to manage their consumption and production choices slightly differently. Okay, now that was quite a long one there, but hopefully that makes a reasonable amount of sense, and that is starting to break the back of this booklet. Okay, quite a lot of things that we've covered that we might need to talk about face to face when we get back into school, but hopefully that will make sense, and I will put this one on Teams very shortly, and hopefully we'll be able to sort of move forward from there. So thanks for listening.